everyone. Thank you for joining us. It is 10 o'clock, but we are going to give this a couple minutes. Ooh, I froze up for a minute. Sorry, technology might be an issue. I'll talk about that here in a minute, but people still is start, but we're going to log on. We see the number climbing quite a bit, so if you just give us another minute, then we'll get started. If you are just logging on, we were unable to send out corresponding handout documents for this training before uploaded. So if you are already logged on while we're waiting for more attendees to log on, feel free to download those. There are two documents. One is the utility allowance baseline spreadsheet that Sarah will go into in depth. So if you download or open any of those forms, that's the one you're going to want to look at today while we're presenting. And then the webinar training handouts PDF are more for your reference when you're completing those. So I'll give you guys a second to open those as well. Okay. Okay. Well, I'm going to go ahead and get started. It looks like we still have a couple people going on, but it's our attendee list has stalled out for a second. Again, welcome. We are so glad you could join us virtually today. My name is Jacqueline Raffin. I serve KHRC as the Director of Contract Administration for KHRC. The training session you are about to attend is on Section 8 utility allowances, and it will be presented by KHRC's lead finance officer, Sara Hall. But I also wanted to take time to introduce you to other members of our contract administration finance team. Wasini Hicks and Liz Gouge are both finance officers, and all three of these ladies help process all the tasks that make up your rent adjustments, special claims, contract renewals, and even vouchers. The information provided in this presentation will be geared toward our Section 8 project. And it will cover everything from completing the UA baseline spreadsheet to the utility allowance factor, as well as best practices on keeping up to date resident utility release forms. But before all of our tax credit folks hear Section 8 training and start to leave, I highly recommend that you stay. This information is extremely important and extremely helpful for gathering utility data and getting your property's annual allowance. So I used to be in the tax credit world. I understand that there are several tax credit properties. There's a couple ways to determine that utility allowance each year. However, the most accurate way is to collect the actual tenant data, and this presentation will show you exactly how to do that. We'll have great tools for you to be successful in completing that. So stay with us. Also, I wanted to let people know that during our outreach for this training, we had a couple of inquiries about if this class would cover information on our Kansas Emergency Rental System, our KHRA programs, utility assistance, and how to apply. Unfortunately, we will not be covering any information on our KHRA program today. However, if you do have questions on how to apply for rental or utility assistance, I encourage you to go to our website at kshousingcorp.org, and the care folks there can help you. A couple housekeeping things before we get started. There will be training certificates that are emailed directly to all the active participants Upon completion of the session, these certificates are automatically generated by our GoToWebinar software. So you should receive those within a day or two, pretty quick. To limit distractions during the presentation, we do have all attendees' mics muted and all cameras turned off. We have tested the sound and visuals on our end. So if you cannot hear or see the presentation, please check your computer settings and speakers, etc. Now, we had a couple network issues this morning. I seem to be pretty clear now, but if we freeze up for a minute, just bear with us. We'll work it out, get back on. Hopefully we won't miss a beat with the training too much. So apologies in advance for that. If you do have questions for Sara during her presentation, please type your questions into the questions feature box on your GoToWebinar control panel. I know a lot of you who have attended these kind of trainings with us are familiar with that, so continue to do that. We are also recording this webinar. So if you need to refer back to it, excuse me, or know coworkers that were not able to attend this live session, the recording should be on our website within a couple weeks. So that will be loaded onto the website here after a bit. The PowerPoint slides that you'll see today during the training, though, will not be available. So take notes, make sure you refer to those handouts for that information. So yeah, there's about 5 different documents that you need to refer to, but if you open any of those, like I said, make sure that that utility allowance baseline spreadsheet is one that you have open, because Sara will go over that in quite detail. And lastly, before I turn it over to Sara, I want to put a plug in for our housing conference. A lot of you should have received a save the date housing conference email on Monday afternoon regarding compliance sessions that we will be having for our virtual Kansas Housing Conference. If you haven't already, please participate in that attached survey. Gary Kirkman, who I know you all know from E&A team, and Scott Michael Dunn from Costello will be co-hosting a live Q&A session for the Section 8 and tax credit compliance during the conference. So it's going to be very interactive, and we are looking for your feedback on some of the hot topics regarding compliance, either the tax credit or Section 8, that you would like Gary and Scott Michael to address during their 90-minute live training session. I also updated the banner in Procorum with the link to that survey there too. So you can find that email on Monday. You can go into Procorum Work Center and find the link to that survey. Okay, I think that's my spiel. I will let Sara get started. Thank you all again and enjoy.
Okay, thank you so much, Jackie. I'm really excited to get started. We're really happy to be able to put on a series of mini trainings for our owner agents. The HUD world, as you know, can be complicated and overwhelming, sometimes frustrating. So we wanted to put on these training series to make your jobs, our jobs, easier. So that's what we're excited to do for you today. We're going to talk about utility analysis. I'm hoping you can all hear me, see my screen. Jackie, if you pop on, if something goes wrong and you can't see my screen, just let me know. We are going to, well, now it's not going to let me move. There we go. Okay, for today, we're going to talk about several things. We're going to define what a utility allowance is, what a utility analysis is, when it's due. We will talk in detail about the 2 different types. There's a baseline and a factor. We'll talk about what happens when the allowance decreases, what happens when it increases, and then tenant notification requirements. Topics that we'll talk about today. After each little section, I will stop and take some time to answer any questions that you have. If you want to type those into the question box, Jackie will read them, and then I can address those for everyone to hear. All right, we're going to dive right in. So what is a utility allowance? So according to HUD, a utility allowance is defined as the monthly cost of a reasonable consumption of such utilities and other services for the unit by an energy conservative household of modest circumstances. That sounds like HUD. So let's talk about what this really means. The utility allowance is the dollar amount that HUD will pay towards tenant paid utilities. It's an average calculation of actual tenant usage. You can find this amount if your property has a utility allowance on your rent schedule under column 5. So in this example, this property has a utility allowance of $98. What is a utility analysis? So the analysis is a methodology that was released in a housing notice, 1504, and this is a methodology to calculate the average utility consumption based on actual tenant usage. And that's important. These analyses are used using actual tenant data or usage. This analysis is completed by you, the owner agent. And that's what we're going to talk about. How do you do this? When do you do this? And then after that's completed, you send it to the contract administrator, and that's us. So we're going to review that and ultimately approve that for you. There are 2 types of utility analysis. One is a baseline, the other is a factor. And again, we'll talk in detail about both of these types. When are these due? When is a utility analysis due? Short answer, every year. So during the annual rent adjustment for your property, you have to adjust your allowance, your utility allowance, by either a baseline or a factor. So every year, this number is going to be adjusted. Now it could go up or down. Some circumstances it could stay what the current amount is, but every year it will be adjusted. How do you know when you're due, when it's up? So I think most of you who are attending are familiar with our letter that we send out, and that's about 210 days before your annual rent adjustment. We will upload a letter to Procorum, to the work center, and we'll let you know what you need to do with your utilities this year. So we'll tell you if it needs to be adjusted by a baseline or if you have the option to adjust the allowance by the factor. Here's just an example, a little snip of that letter in case you are fairly new and haven't. So I'll bring your attention to the first example here where it's highlighted must complete baseline. Right before that, we're going to let you know when the last time your property completed a baseline. In this example, a baseline was completed in February of 2019. So that means that this property does not have a choice. They have to complete a baseline analysis. In our second example, this property completed their last baseline in 2020. You can see from the highlighted section, we're letting you know you have the choice. You can use the factor, which is UAF, or you can complete a new baseline. So that's important for owner agents to realize that even if you're not due for a baseline this year, you can select to complete one, and depending on what's going on at the property at the time. Okay, so we're going to ask you to tell us what you want to do, especially if you have that choice for this year. So along with that letter that we upload to your work center, which is 210-day notice is what it's called in your work center, we're also going to give you a rent adjustment checklist. And I'm sure you are very familiar with this checklist as well. Lots of areas that we want you to complete so that we have the most current and accurate information at your property. One of those is your selection of how you want the utilities to be adjusted. So if you are required to do a baseline this year, you will have to check the baseline box. However, if you do have the choice, we will want you to let us know what you're choosing to do. Now we'll make I do want to let you all know that sometimes when properties are not due for a baseline and they're allowed to choose the factor, some of our properties select to choose to complete another baseline. That's completely okay. However, just keep in mind, if we see that you have selected to complete a baseline, one of our finance officers will probably reach out to you just to have a short conversation. We want to know is there something going on at your property that, you know, a baseline instead of the factor. Okay, I want to take a moment to answer any questions that you have so far. Next, we will be talking in detail about the baseline analysis. Are there any questions so far?
You must be doing an amazing job, which you are, because there's no questions.
Okay.
Yet.
Well, we haven't really got into the nitty gritty yet, so I'm sure that there will be questions here later on. So, okay, well, if at any time you do have questions about something that I've talked about already, go ahead and put it into the question box and we'll get to it as soon as we can. All right, so we're going to dive into the baseline analysis. So this is going to be the bulk of this presentation. So there's several topics we're going to talk about. When is this required? We've touched on that a little bit. We'll talk about the date range of your data, sample size, tenant household requirements, requesting data from the utility company, and then completing the spreadsheet, the baseline spreadsheet, because it can look a little overwhelming. And that is one of the handouts that you have. So when we get to that section, I encourage you to open that up. Last, we're going to touch on baselines during rehab or construction. All right, when is it due? We've touched on this a little bit. Baseline analysis is going to be due every 3 years. So this is designed to ensure that the allowance that's calculated is reflective of really current usage. So this is a benefit to your tenants, these baselines. We want to make sure that the number that's calculated for this allowance average is accurate. And so HUD requires these baselines to be completed every 3 years. Now, I did touch on how you can know when that baseline was that you had for your property last on those 210 letters. If you are not in the middle of your annual rent adjustment, please feel free to call us at any time. If you're considering doing a baseline, if you're not due for one, but you don't remember when the last one was, please call, email. We'll be happy to look that up for you and let you know. All right, so we're going to first talk about sample size. Sample size is required number of units to be included in the analysis. Sorry, give me just one second. Okay, so it's the required number of units to be included in your baseline. And we're going to figure out how many units are required by looking at this figure 1. It's based on the total number of contract units in each floor plan. So this is important to keep in mind. I know many properties have multiple floor plans. And so when you're figuring out what your sample size is, you'll have to look at your 0, 1, 2, 3, 4-bedroom total units. The other important piece of this is that they can only include your HAP contract units, your Section 8 units. I know that I'm sure many of you have non-Section 8 units at your properties. Those units cannot be included in your sample. We cannot analyze the data from those units. So make sure that when you're looking at your sample and how many units you need to collect, that you're only looking at your Section 8 ones. Okay, and then I mentioned this is included a couple of places. This figure 1 is on the HUD housing notice. It's also, we've included it on our spreadsheet for you to reference. Okay, so we're going to get into an example here. If your property has 15, and let's see if I can use my little laser pointer. Okay, so if your property has, or in this example, rather, this property has 15 contract units in their 0-bedroom floor plan. So if we look at the figure 1 and we find where does 15 fall, and between 1 and 20, it'll tell us the minimum, excuse me, the minimum sample size that's required. And in this case, it will be all of them. So they'll have to supply all 15 units. So in the next example, this property has 113 1-bedroom units. So if we look over to figure 1, find where 113 falls, right here, we'll scoot over. The minimum sample in this case is 24. So they will be required to send in 24 units for their 2-bedroom. So I'll let you reference the rest of these, but that's how you're going to find out how many units are required for you to include in this baseline. And something important I want to mention, there are variety of reasons why the minimum sample size can't be submitted. And so if that's the case, if you are required to send in, in the first example, let's say 15, but for whatever reason you can't, you can only send us 14 or 11, please let us know. We'll talk about why you can't send it. Maybe if there's something that we can help, if it's just about getting the data, we can talk through that. As we get down to the spreadsheet, I'll show you where you'll be able to provide that explanation for us. Okay, continuing with sample size, there are things to consider with the units that you do include. So again, you want to make sure that you're including the correct number that's required according to Figure 1. Second, you can only supply units that have at least 10 months of usage. So if you have a unit that maybe a tenant has only been in there 6 months, the other 6 months it was vacant, that will not be able to be included in your sample. We have to have 10 months of usage. Otherwise, we don't really get an accurate number. And second, I've touched on only your Section 8 contract units can be included in your sample. Okay, this leads me to, we have a couple of these best practice tips. Include more units in your sample size than is required. This will save everyone a lot of time and probably a little frustration. So when we receive your baseline spreadsheets and we're looking at the units that you've included, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to do a review of all of the information you send us. It's possible that during that review, we may have to remove a unit for whatever reason, or possibly several months of data for whatever reason, and we'll communicate that with you. So let's say, for example, that you send us, actually go back real quickly. Let's say that you send us 20, your minimum sample size required. Maybe you have 25 units of a 1-bedroom. You only have to send us 20. But let's say that during our review, we find that the data is not usable and we have to remove it. That's going to drop the sample size that we have to 19. That means we're going to have to go back to you and say, hey, we need you to get one more unit for us. That's going to mean for you, you're going to have to go back to the utility company and request that again. And it takes a lot of time. It's a little frustrating. I know you all have a lot other better things that you'd rather spend your time doing than collecting tenant data. So best practice, if you're required to send in 20 units, send us 23. And so forth. So send a few extra just in case we get to the point where we have to remove them. It'll save us a lot of time. And it'll make your job and our job a lot more smooth. Okay, we've discussed about units to include, so let's move on to some units that you do not want to include in this sample. If a tenant is receiving a flat utility rate as part of a low income rate assistance utility, you cannot include that in the sample. If your tenant is receiving an increased allowance as a reasonable accommodation, you cannot include that in your sample. And lastly, I touched on this earlier, if a unit is vacant or has been vacant for 2 or more months, you cannot include it in your sample. And this is designed so that we have the most accurate numbers and usage that we possibly can, because again, this is directly affecting your tenants and it's for their benefit. Okay, that wraps up sample size. So I'll take a moment and see if there are any questions.
Yes, we have a couple of great questions. Our first one, we want confirmation that only Section 8 units are included in a sample size for a Section 8 utility allowance.
Correct. So my understanding that you're just making sure that that is the case. When you submit units in your sample size for a baseline analysis, they can only be your Section 8 units. That is correct.
Okay, great. And then a couple more. This is a great question. Is there any reason we cannot submit all units for a baseline?
No, there's not. If you want to collect all the units that you have, go for it. Now, I will tell you, if you have, I don't know, let's say 100 units of a one bedroom, you can certainly request 100 units of data and plug that into your spreadsheet and send it to us. Absolutely, that's going to get us a pretty accurate number. However, I'll tell you, you might change your mind when you start entering 100 units on the spreadsheet. So that's going to be your call. We'll leave that up to you, but absolutely, you can definitely send all of your units in.
And then how would a property manager or owner know if a resident is getting a flat rate?
We will touch on that a little bit here going forward. So the tenants are required to disclose that information. And so when you're doing either if you're moving in a tenant or doing an annual recertification, those are questions that you're going to want to ask. Otherwise, I don't know that you would know. So it is important to ask those questions, especially the annual recert time.
And then I have one more question, unless another one comes up. What if we don't have enough for the sample size?
Send us what you can. But I will say you have to let us know why you can't send the minimum sample size. If you want to put in as many as you have available into the spreadsheet and send it to us, and then I'll show you here in a little bit where you can type in some remarks and explain to us why you haven't been able to include the minimum. Or if you want to just give us a call, make a post in Procorum and let us know our baseline's coming up, but we're required to send in 20 units, but I can't. We'll call you, we'll talk it through, we'll ask why, make sure it's nothing that we can't get over or work through. But if that's going to be the case sometimes. You just data or we don't have enough usage and there's nothing that we can do or you. So that's okay. That happens.
Okay, that
Anything
was
else?
it. That was the last one.
Okay, great questions. Okay, we're going to move on to the date range of your data. Okay, so when completing a baseline analysis, is there a limit to the age of data used to make the analysis? I'm not going to read this whole answer. This comes from a HUD frequently asked question, but I do want to make note of the underlined sentence at the bottom. Generally be no more than 18 months old. Like I said before, these baselines are really designed so that we can get the most accurate and current information on utilities so that it benefits the tenants in a positive way. So we want to make sure that we're not using old data. So the guideline that we follow is generally no more than 18 months old. So we are flexible with that because we understand utilities bill differently, their billing cycles are differently. So you may not be able to get the month that we're asking for, and that's okay. And we'll talk about that here a little bit later. But in general, we want your data to be no more than 18 months old. Okay, so a couple of other points when we're talking about your date range. You want to determine the date range of the required data by your rent adjustment anniversary date. This table here on this slide can be found on our spreadsheet, the baseline spreadsheet. So you will find in that first column what anniversary date of your rent adjustment. I'm going to use February for an example. So for a February 1st, 2022 rent adjustment, if you go to that middle column, the highlighted one, these are the dates of data that we want you to request from the provider. You're going to want July of 2020 through June of 2021. Now, the column to the right is going to be when it's due. So the due date is going to be 180 days before your property's anniversary date. When you're collecting or requesting this data from your utility company, it's important to ensure that you have 12 consecutive months. We can't use data, say maybe you request July through June and you get July through September, and for whatever reason, maybe there's a couple of months that we're missing, and you might think, oh, that's okay, I still have plenty more months to include. No, we need consecutive 12 months. So if you find out the reason why it was left out, go back to your provider. It needs to be consecutive 12-month period. Last, each utility must include the same date range. So there are many properties who, well, we have a good mix of both, who have just one utility that the tenants pay, could be gas or electric, and then other properties where the tenants pay electric and gas and possibly water, trash. So when you're requesting data from your utility, you'll want to make sure that you give the same date range to each utility company. Now, I will say I know that the utility providers all have different billing cycles, different statement dates, different dates where they're collect or where usage, and we understand that. So you're not going to get utility and gas that both have the exact same start date. So you just want to make sure that it's within the same period. Uh, okay, and actually that really wraps up our date range of data. I feel like that was a little shorter than I thought, but what questions do you have about date range of the data needed?
I don't have any questions for you yet, Sarah, but I'm going to just give them another couple seconds to see if anything gets
Sure,
typed.
sure. And remember, if you can't think of a question now, but something further on kind of sparks a question of something that we've already talked about, please don't hesitate. Go ahead and ask that question. I want to make sure this is what this is designed for. We want to answer all the questions that you have. So please ask, even if your question comes up a little later. Still nothing, Jackie?
I have one, but it's about a specific property, so I'm going to answer that in a private message.
Okay. Okay. Very
Okay.
good. Well, we're going to go ahead and move on and talk about tenant requirements. Okay, as you know, there's lots of requirements for the owner agents, for you all, for the tenants. It's a little overwhelming. Um, so we're going to try to break that down a little bit for you. And more specifically, as we're talking about your utilities. Utility companies may require a tenant release as a condition of providing that data that you need for these baselines. I don't know that all of them do, but I'm going to say the good majority will require a tenant release form. So it's safe to assume that you will need one. Your tenants are required to sign this release. And so that reference is in 24 CRF and the HUD model lease. They unfortunately don't have that choice. They need to sign this so that we can collect the usage data. In addition to signing the release forms, they're also required to provide utility data and documentation if you request. Now, I will say that you do have the option to collect the tenant utility usage data directly from the tenant if you would like to. If that's an easy way for you to do it, go for it. And they're required to comply with your request. I don't know that we have a whole lot of our owner agents who collect the data that way. I think they find it easier to make one request to the utility company. But I do want to mention that if you would like to request that information from your direct, you can do so, and they are required to comply with that request. All right, so the request for a signed release doesn't have to correspond with your household's recertification. You can ask for this release to be signed at any point throughout the year. For HUD programs, once you have a signed release, it does remain applicable for the household's term of tenancy. However, there may be providers that require a tenant's signed release more frequently. So that provider, when you're requesting information, maybe you obtained a release from your tenant a couple of years ago, and now it's time to do your baseline. So you send that in, and the utility provider says, this doesn't look current. They may require an updated copy. So that leads us to our next best practice tip. Collect a utility release form at every move-in and at every annual recertification. I think that's going to save everyone a lot of time, kind of last minute trying to collect these utility releases when it's time to do your baseline. If you make that just part of your process, that you have to collect information from the tenant anyway during that time. You're going to be in communication. One more document, throw that in there, talk to them about what it means, stick it in the file, and do that every year. And then when it's time to do your baseline, there won't be a question on whether or not you have an updated release, or even if you have a release. It will make the request to the utility provider much easier. And you'll be able to submit your information for the baseline a lot quicker. Okay, I'm not going to necessarily go over this slide, but this is the top half of that tenant release form. This is included in your handouts. So I just threw this in here so you all knew what that looked like. This is the top form, or top part of that form rather, and then the bottom. And that's about all I'm going to go over with that release form, but you do have that available for you to reference. Okay, so we had a question earlier about how do you know if they're receiving assistance or receiving anything from a source outside of HUD. Households are required to disclose whether they're receiving utility assistance from sources other than HUD. This is really important for you owner agents to ask every year at their annual recertification. It's possible that if they are receiving utility assistance, that it could come into play when calculating their tenant rent. So I'm not going to talk too much about that. There are a couple references here for you that you can look into to read more on that. If you have more questions about assistance outside of HUD, please reach out to us after this presentation. We'd be more than happy to talk more about it with you. I do want to make, though, another quick note about if your tenant does receive assistance, they still can receive the HUD utility allowance. It's not an either or. We just need to make sure that they that we account for that. We know exactly what they do receive. And there are penalties for tenants who don't comply. On this, the penalty ultimately can result in termination of tenancy. So if you get to the point where your tenant is just not complying with your requests, or if they haven't disclosed information that they should have, you found out later, if they refuse to sign a tenant release form or provide utility data, you can there are penalties, and it could result in termination of tenancy. That's all I'm going to say about that. So if you do have questions about that, or if you're in a situation where you think you may have to do that, please reach out and we'll talk more about it with you. All right, so that kind of wraps up the tenant requirements. So I've got one more slide before we take some questions. And this is, so we've talked about up until now, what do you need to get ready before you make that request to your utility company? You need to make sure you determine the correct sample size, how many units, and remember, you're going to ask for more than is required. You will know the date range of the data. You'll look at your rent adjustment anniversary date, so you'll know exactly the date range that you need to collect, or request rather. You will gather your tenant release forms, and this should be real simple if you've gathered them or if you've collected those every year. So you should just be able to pull them real easily and get those together. You will need to know which utilities you'll need to request. So we'll touch on that a little bit later. So if you have just electric, of course, you'll just ask for electric data. If you have both, you'll want to request both. And remember, these are the utilities that your tenants pay for, not the ones that are included in your rent. All right, so now you're ready to contact your utility company, request this information. Every utility company is going to be a little bit different in how they prefer these requests to be made, and probably a procedure they may want you to follow. So I highly recommend contacting your utility company, and you can even do this before you're ready to submit. Find out how they want you to submit. What's the fastest, easiest way? Is it by fax, email? Hop on the website, click a button, just find out how they want you to request that information, and that'll make it a lot easier when it's time to actually make that request. Now, once you do make that request, some utility companies may get that back to you really fast, which would be great. Some may take their time, so it's important to follow up. Don't make that request and then just forget about it. So I suggest following up. If you haven't heard anything in a week, definitely reach back out and say, hey, I made this request. Is there anything additional that you need from us? Maybe they're missing some information. And follow up as you need to. Okay, so that wraps up this section. We'll stop again if anyone has questions.
Yes, I have a couple that I'm glad people asked. I was hoping
Mhm,
that we'd
mhm.
have some people ask this.
Okay.
Do we need the actual numbers, the actual amount of each for each month, or can we get their average for each unit from the utility company?
That's a good question. So when you make a request to the utility company, some utility companies are not going to actually give you the actual number. They may provide you with the average, and if that's what they give you, that's okay. It'll make it a lot easier when you enter that information. Um, it's better if we can get actual numbers. We're going to have a more accurate allowance number, but if the utility company has provided you with averages, then that's what we have to use. Great question.
Yeah, good question. I have another one, and then Jean, make sure if I'm not asking this correctly, make sure you type in again and clarify. But I think the question is, how do we adjust the utility allowance when the tenant's usage is beyond what the utility allowance is?
I'm not sure if I understand the question. Jackie, can you read that one more time?
Yep. How do we adjust utility allowance when the tenant's usage is beyond the allowance? And I think I think the long answer is you're not able to. So that's why it's important to either you can choose to do the baseline every year so you get the most accurate data. So hopefully that we avoid any utility allowances that are way less than what their actual usage is, what they're actually paying.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, that's what these baselines are for. We want to make sure that we're collecting actual data, because that's what the tenants are paying. They're paying the actual cost. So when it's time to do a baseline, and maybe you have tenants that are paying quite a bit in their utilities, let's make sure we get those included in the baseline. Put as many units as you can in the sample, so that at the end of the day we can come up with a number that really is an accurate number. Now, there may be some situations where we come up with your new allowance and you have some tenants that maybe are just paying, a lot more. Um, and maybe that's just a matter of, just leaving lights on all the time, lots of usage, just maybe a little bit more than ordinary. And that's something that if you have further questions on, individual tenants and what they're paying versus the allowance, definitely reach out to us. We can talk a little bit further about that. Really, the point though that I'd like to make is that these baselines, we want to get an accurate number. So we encourage you to send us as many units as you can so that we have an accurate number. I'm hoping that
yeah,
answered a little bit of your question, but if not, please reach out and I can try to answer that further.
yeah, there are several properties we have in our portfolio that do a baseline every year, even though they're not
Hmm.
required to, just to
Hmm.
make sure they are getting the most accurate data so their tenants are not having to overpay on their utilities.
Yep. Any other questions?
That's all I have now.
All
So
right. Okay, so now we're going to get into the fun part. We're going to complete the spreadsheet. So if you want to open up that spreadsheet, the next several slides that I have are just going to be snips of the spreadsheet, and I'm going to talk to you about what it means and how to complete it. You don't have to open it, of course, but if you'd like to and kind of click around, get familiar with it, that's really kind of what my first slide here is. We have kind of customized this um, spreadsheet to make it a little bit easier for you. There are formulas and calculations that are done on the spreadsheet that come from HUD. So those types of things we haven't changed, but we've added a few little instruction pieces, tabs labeled at the bottom, just to help you complete this when it's time. So I do also want to mention real briefly that once you get this data back from your utility company, you're going to open the spreadsheet and start entering that data. Um, Now, we do have some properties that contract with a third party to complete their baselines for them. And that's okay if you choose to go that route. I'm not going to talk about that today, but if you have questions, if you just want to know more, or if you are a property that does use a third party and you have questions, reach out afterwards and we can talk to you about that. So what I'm going to talk about is you as the owner agents completing this spreadsheet. This spreadsheet will always be uploaded to your work center if your property is due for a baseline this year. If you're not due, I mean, you all that are attending have a copy of this now, but if at any point you need a copy of the spreadsheet, you can reach out anytime and we'll send that to you. All right, so get familiar with the tabs at the bottom. Click through them. Like I said, we've added a few. So we've got the UA methodology tab, the suggested date range, which we've talked about. We do have that table on this tab for you. And then we have 5 floor plans. So you want to get familiar with it. Each bedroom tab is identical. So again, when we're putting these baselines together, you have to enter data for each bedroom size separately. So we're gonna have a 0 bedroom utility allowance, a 1 bedroom, a 2 bedroom, and then so forth if you have additional. You're going to complete the blue and the orange cells for each of your bedroom sizes. All right, so this looks overwhelming. There's a lot of information here. This is the spreadsheet as a whole. It does, it looks overwhelming. It's not, so we're gonna break it down and I'm gonna tell you, talk about each section of this spreadsheet. All right, so in your top left, small little section with some instructions, the highlighted areas that you see on the slide will be basic information. So project name, your contract number, and then again, I want to remind you that each tab is individual. So this particular tab is for 0 bedroom. You're going to want to enter your total 0 bedroom unit. So if you have 10, if you have 100, you'll enter that number here. And then you're going to want to enter what is the current utility allowance for that bedroom size. And earlier I mentioned that you can find that number on the last approved rent schedule under column 5. So you'll enter that current utility allowance right here. That's it, this top part. All right, so we're gonna scoot across the top, and there's a couple areas here on this spreadsheet that really don't affect your allowance number, but it's a really great opportunity for us to make sure and for you to make sure that we have your rent schedule accurate. So this section here on the left, the baseline spreadsheet table, you're gonna let us know which utilities you have on your property and who pays for them, and then which type. So under heating, if the tenant pays for this, you'll put a T. If it's gas, you'll put G, and then you'll just complete that table. What you'll want to also pay attention to at this time, open up your last rent schedule and make sure that it matches what you're entering on the spreadsheet now. And if it doesn't, just say that we've got a mistake on the rent schedule, or if there's a box checked that shouldn't be, or if it says gas and it's electric, now's the time to let us know. Just send us a quick post in per quorum and let us know that something's not right. Give us a call. We'll get that fixed. The other section right next to that is going to be for your equipment and furnishings. This is the same thing. So let us know, do you have this at your property? Take a look at your rent schedule. Does it match? Okay, moving down. So the only orange tabs on this spreadsheet is going to be under this first row under electric. This is where you'll enter your unit numbers. Very important to enter these numbers accurately. You'll also want to make sure that the unit numbers that you're entering match the data that you received from the utility company. That's going to make it a lot easier to make sure, especially during our review. If we see unit 1 and there's data, but on the documents you received from the utility company, it says maybe 1A. We can assume that that's probably the case, but make sure that these unit numbers match that data. Now, these are the only cells that are going to carry through. So if you have electric, gas, water, trash, you only have to enter your unit numbers one time. All right, underneath unit number, it says STMT, statement date. So this statement date is you're going to look at the documents you received from the utility company. You'll want to make sure that the date range is accurate. And you'll start with the oldest, and you can enter the statement date if you'd like to. You can enter the month. Now I will tell you, I think I mentioned that a lot of utility companies are not on the same billing cycle, so the dates are going to look a little different, and that's okay. So whatever your electric says, enter that there. Then find the one that most closely matches for your gas and enter that one. So here's the overview of your electric, gas, water, sewer, and trash. So as you can see, that orange tab is going to be where you enter the unit numbers, and then that will carry down for the next 3 rows. You will enter the statement dates according to what's on your data you received. All right, entering the utility data. Lots of important things here that I want to make sure we go over. You're going to include only actual utility costs. So this means that you cannot include a disconnect fee, a reconnect fee, or late fees. And every now and then we've seen a little bit unusual charge on someone's statement. So you want to make sure that it's usage. If you've got a disconnect fee included in the usage and they give you a total cost on that statement, you'll need to subtract out that disconnect fee or whatever that fee is. You won't want to round. Give us the actual number. Put that in there. This spreadsheet's going to do averaging for us. So let's use the accurate the actual number. You will not want to exclude high or low months. So you may have tenants that have some extremely high usage in maybe the summer or the winter. That's all right. That's their actual usage. Include that in there. Don't be tempted to remove higher and low numbers. You also want to make sure that what you are including in this is full months. So at least well, not at least, I'm sorry, but you want a full month, not partial data. So how do you know if it's a full month? The statement that you receive from your utility provider should give you number of days in the billing cycle. We've seen some companies have maybe 25 days in their billing cycle, some have 30. So if you're looking through a statement and you see a month on there that maybe has 10 usage days on it, you're going to toss that. We can't use it. It's not a full month. It's not going to give us an accurate, maybe that's when your tenant moved out mid-month. So make sure you're including a full months of data. Last, your data follows the unit, not your tenant. So it's possible that you will have data information from 2 different tenants in the same unit. That's okay. And it's possible you may have a tenant that has transferred. So their information, their usage information could appear in 2 different units. That's okay. So your data follows the unit, not the tenant. All right, moving on. So there is a remarks box. There's actually 2 remarks boxes. This blue one is for you. This is where I mentioned earlier, if you cannot meet your sample size, or if there's other information that you want to tell us, if you have a couple partial months that you had to take out, anything that you want to tell us will go in this box. Just type it out. That way, when we get it, we'll look at this comment box and see, okay, well, that's why they didn't include this. It was vacant, or that tenant was only there for 6 months. If you don't put remarks in this box and we're reviewing your spreadsheet and we have questions about why did you not include this unit, we're going to have to reach out to you. So it's important that if there are units that are not included or if there's any other information, just put it in this box. We can avoid some of that back and forth. As much as we enjoy talking to you, you got a lot better things to do. So give us as much information as you can in this remarks box. All right, so here, this one kind of makes you dizzy when you look at it. This is where this spreadsheet's going to do a lot of calculations and spit out some averages for us. So as you can see, it's divided out between the type of utility, and that first highlighted at the top, and then at the bottom, that highlighted area is going to show us the averages for those utilities. There's nothing that you need to do here. This should be locked, so you shouldn't be able to click or change any of this. Nothing you need to do. So this is just for you to look at. All right, so I think this is at the end of, or at the bottom of that screen that I just had. This is going to give you your summary. So if you have more than one utility at your property, of course, you're going to have an electric and a gas, maybe a water, maybe trash. So that first tab that I showed you where you need to enter the current utility allowance, it's important to do that because that number is going to carry down. Let me get my pointer. So the current utility allowance right here. Uh, if you put that number in at the beginning, you can really easily compare to what the proposed new allowance will be, and you'll have a good idea of what this is going to do. Now remember, you're going to complete this and submit it to us. We're going to review it. So at this time when you submit it, it's not approved, but we're going to look at it, but you'll have a pretty good idea of what it's doing. Now, there's another comment box, and that's for the KHRC staff who are reviewing this. This is where we're going to maybe make some comments of things that we found. Maybe there was a typo that we fixed, or maybe there was nothing. Maybe it was a perfect submission, which would be fantastic. We're also going to put in the date that we approved this and the final number that we've approved. Okay, that's a lot of information. We are close. Got one more slide before I pause for questions. After you've completed the spreadsheet, what do? We need to get it to us. So couple of things to keep in mind. You're going to have utility data from your utility company, and that file you'll want to save as a PDF. We prefer you to save it as in one document. If it's easier for you to break out your bedroom sizes, that is totally okay. You can save one file as 1 bedroom, the other one is 2 bedroom. You'll want to make sure that that data is labeled very clearly. So as we're looking through and we're reviewing that data against what you've put in your spreadsheet, we want to make sure we know which data goes with which entry on your spreadsheet. So if you need to label the unit numbers, if it's helpful to put the address or the name, somehow make sure we can clearly see where it belongs. Then you're going to upload that to Procorum. And of course, we have our naming matrix that we follow with every document. So that'll be named PBCA, your property name. You'll put in the date that you upload it to us. And then at the end, you'll call it UAB support docs. And then your spreadsheet. This is the only, I think this is the only document that we do not want as a PDF. And that's because we need to get in there and look at it and make some comments. So make sure your information is all completed, save it as the Excel document, and then again, you're going to upload that into Procorum as UAB spreadsheet. All right, so after you've uploaded these into Procorum Work Center, make sure it's in the right folder if it's for your rent adjustment or for a contract renewal. If you're not sure, give us a call. We can walk that through with you, and then mark that task off as complete. Okay, that was a lot. Sure, there's probably questions. So we'll take a few minutes to see what questions you have.
You know, this is something that we usually get the most questions about, but I don't have anything typed in the question box. So I'm going to give everyone a couple minutes, and I guess I'll put a little best practice note to everyone while we're waiting for questions to possibly be asked, that utility baselines do take a lot of time because you are working with your tenants to get their for them to consent to get the utility data, and then you're working with the utility company to get them to send that to you. And it sometimes takes a lot of effort to remind a tenant to come in and sign, remind your utility company to send in the data. So I just encourage owner agents to be proactive when you do have a baseline. It does take a lot of time, and we don't want any delays in your rent adjustments or your contract renewals for any reason. So just make sure you, for those baselines that are due the 3rd year, that you're on top of your tenants to get the information you need and the utility company. I think I have a question.
Okay.
From Megan. This one's about a tax credit. Is this process the same for Section 42 contracts? Yes, it is one of them. So there's a couple different ways Section 8 tax credit properties can get their utility allowance, and this is the most accurate way because you are getting the actual tenant data, averaging it, and so your utility allowance will be reflected most accurately. So this is one of the ways. For the other couple ways to do that, I would contact Katie Whitehead, Terry Bradshaw on our tax credit division. But I wanted to make sure that that the Section 42 and tax credit folks attended this training, because this is one of the ways that you can calculate that.
Yep, it sure is. Any other questions, Jackie?
Yes. Is
Okay.
this spreadsheet used strictly for HUD reporting?
Yes, this spreadsheet was created by HUD. We've customized that. So this spreadsheet is, although that's actually a good question. Maybe you're asking if the tax credit properties use the same spreadsheet. And I want to say yes, but that's definitely a question that you'll want to follow up with our tax credit division if that's what you were asking. I'm not sure if I
Yes.
answered that right. Okay.
It's based on a HUD spreadsheet, so we've tweaked it to give us a little bit more information. But the short answer to your question, Josh, is that no, you can use this spreadsheet for your tax credit units also, if this is helpful, and it should be. Another question: how do we make reports on our units that are vacant because of the pandemic?
Just let us know if you want to give us a call ahead of the baseline. That is coming up. You've got some high vacancy or some just extenuating circumstances that you want to talk through. Just give us a call or post in Procorum and say, hey, can somebody call me? I want to talk about this. We can definitely talk that through with you. And I'm going to touch on real high vacancy here in just a moment.
Okay. Great questions, but that is all that I have right now.
Okay, so kind of to go along with that, there are times that your properties are going to go through rehab, construction, or possibly experience a very high vacancy rate or period. So if your property is due for a utility baseline this year or whichever year, and you're in the middle of a bunch of rehab, lots of construction, maybe you've moved residents, so there's nobody in this particular building that you need to get your baseline on, or maybe you're going through some extremely high vacancy. I do want to make sure that I point out extremely high. We're not talking about just regular vacancy rates that you might experience throughout the year. But if you're going through something pretty extreme, please let us know. We can contact your HUD account executive, talk through some options. So again, this baseline is designed so that we can give you a utility allowance that's accurate and beneficial to your tenants. If we're not going to be able to collect accurate information, or if there's just not enough, it's not going to do your tenants any good. So, and I think HUD recognizes that. And so let's just have a conversation. If you've got stuff going on at the property, give us a call. We can contact your HUD account executive and come up with a solution. And that's really all I had about that one. So if there's any follow-up questions to that, I'll wait just a minute before we move on.
That was,
I didn't hear you. Sorry, Jackie, did you say there was a question?
No, I said that was fairly quick, so I'm just, I was just going to give them type if they have questions.
Okay, we'll go ahead and move on. If you've got questions, don't just go ahead and type them in there, but we're going to go ahead and move on. So we'll talk about the utility allowance factor now. So the baseline was really the bulk of this, but we've got quite a bit to talk about on the allowance factor as well. All right, so for 2 years after that utility baseline is completed, we're going to have to adjust. Sorry, my chair is being funny. We're going to have to adjust your allowance, like I mentioned earlier, every year. So after you've done a baseline, you get to take the factor for 2 years. And that just means we're going to adjust your current allowance by the factor that's been released by HUD. It's a utility allowance factor. You're going to see and hear UAF. That's what that's referring to. Now, I will let you know, I think I've mentioned this already. If you are not due for a baseline for this particular year, you can still do one. Completely your choice. If maybe you had some rehab and did some energy efficiency work on some of the units, and now you really want to get a better baseline, go for it. Send us in that data and we'll complete one of those for you. But you don't have to. All right, so this factor is released, and it can be found on the HUD user website. I'm not going to read this, but I mean, HUD determines these things by a variety of ways. So if you want a little bit more information on how they come up with these numbers, I would encourage you to go onto the HUD website. We're not going to go too much into that right now, but this table here will let you know. This is the fiscal year 2001 utility allowance factors. And as you can see, and if you've gone through a utility analysis this year, you know that the rate that was released is causing a decrease. So that's fun. We're going to talk more about that, what happens with that later. This factor is released at the same time as the OCAF. Goes into effect February 11th. Now, what that means for you, if you have a property with an anniversary date of March 1st, that's when the new rate will go into effect. So if we're processing a rent adjustment for you that's effective March 1st and you have a baseline, and you have a utility allowance that you're going to be taking the factor for, the new rate will be applied for those properties effective March 1st and after. And as I mentioned, the current rate that's out is causing a decrease in those utility adjustments. Now, I don't know what's going to happen this next year. As we all know, this last couple years have been pretty different. A lot of things going on. So I'm curious to see what these new rates are going to be. Those should be released sometime in October. Okay, you're going to have to make your choice. I've touched on this again. So we will send you a letter and a checklist at the beginning of your rent adjustment, letting you know when your last baseline was, if you're required to have one. If you're not, you can choose to take the factor. You have to let us know that by indicating your selection on the checklist that we provide to you in the work center. Okay, so if you choose to take the factor and have that applied to your current allowance, nothing else that you're going to need to do at this time. There's no spreadsheet that you need to complete. We just need to know that that's your choice. Our financial staff will calculate your new allowance by applying the factor. We will upload a copy of that spreadsheet for you into it's going to look different. It's a UAF spreadsheet, so it will look different than the baseline. But we will upload that to you and let you know what that new allowance number is. All right, so after you receive that from us, this factor adjustment, you will want to look at it. Don't just take it and then just move on. You'll want to look at it. And as I've said, these numbers, this utility allowance is really important to your tenants. We want to make sure it's accurate. So there, you could notice that when we calculated your factor, that well, first of all, this year it's causing a decrease. And so maybe we have had some properties that say, you know what, I don't know that really is accurate based on the usage that we've had. We encourage you, compare the factor allowance amount to what your actual usage is. Look at them. If they're the same or if they're close to the same, that's great. You can just take that number and move forward. But if you find that there's a pretty big difference between the two, you might want to consider doing a baseline this year or that year, and we can just scratch the factor and we'll start collecting, or we'll start processing a baseline for you instead. This is what that spreadsheet's going to look like when we upload it to you in Procorum. I'm sure many of you have received this. The green, let's see, where's my thing? So the green down here is going to be the new utility allowance amount. The factor, we've created this as formulas. So this is what you'll receive from us if you choose the factor. Okay, questions about the utility allowance factor?
Sorry, yes, we have a couple.
Okay.
Let me see where we are. How do programs such as LEAP or Gift of Warmth or any helpful programs that have utility assistance for a one-time payment, does that affect the utility assistance at a Section 8 property?
That's a great question. So you'll want to make sure that you know exactly what type of assistance that tenant has received, the amount, when, So if it's a one-time payment, what is that payment applying? What does it apply to? If it's during the time that you're needing to uh, process a baseline, then if you have more sample units that you can provide us, you can just leave that one out, not even have to worry about it. Um, if you, so I touched on before that tenant really needs to make sure that they let you know, because it could also affect their total tenant rent that they pay. I guess I encourage you, if you do have tenants that are receiving some of that assistance, if you have, just to make our lives a little less complicated, if you have more other units that you can put in your sample, go ahead and do that. Just leave those out. If you don't, let's have another conversation. So certainly reach out if that's the case. If you've got a tenant that's receiving maybe a one-time payment, just contact us and we'll tell you how to treat that when it comes to your baseline.
And then
Anything else?
one more is a comment. So I did want to, and this is a good point, the utility allowance factor only applies to Section 8 properties and not the tax credit properties. So the utility baseline that Sarah went over, that is something that tax credit properties will have, is one option they can do every year. So tax credit and Section 8 do have to do a utility analysis every year, but only a Section 8 properties or Section 8 units can take the utility allowance factor on years 2 and 3 between their baselines. And that's all I've got.
Okay, let's move on. We are just over an hour, so we're very close to being done. I know this is really exciting stuff, so just bear with me. Not too much more to go. Hopefully you're finding this to be helpful and useful. All right, what is next? So utility allowance increase. So after we've reviewed your analysis, whether that's the baseline or the factor, we're going to let you know that it's been approved, or if we've had to change or adjust it, we'll let you know that as well. What happens if we, after our approval, we approve an allowance that is increasing from the previous amount? There's not a whole lot that you have to do. This is the one that we like to see. So an increase in the allowance will cause a decrease in your tenant rent. So state law does not require a written 30-day notice when the tenant rent decreases. However, if you would like to notify your tenants that the amount that they're paying is changing, please feel free to do so. Now, their rent will be changing. Even though it's going to decrease, they'll still be required to sign the 50059A in addition to the owner agent's signature as well. The increases are nice. We like to see those. All right, so, but many of you are very familiar with utility allowance decreases, especially since the factor is causing these to decrease. So a decrease in your allowance is going to cause an increase in your tenant rent. So this means that HUD and state law require the tenant to be provided a 30-day notice of rent increase. So it's going to trigger the notice to the tenant's procedure that can be found in the 24 CRF 245. We're going to talk about that here up next. And again, those tenants are going to need to sign that 50059A along with the owner agent because their rent is changing. All right, so after you've received the approved analysis from us reflecting a decrease, you'll prepare a notice to the tenants and distribute. So when we send you the approved analysis, we're also going to provide you several sample documents. One of those is going to be a sample notice to your tenants. The other one is going to be a sample owner certification. We're going to talk about that at the end. All right, preparing the notice to the tenants. So you'll want to use that sample form that's uploaded in Procorum. This form is specifically for tenants, specifically for where properties have a decrease in their UA. You'll want to make sure you enter the current and the proposed UA amounts, and you're going to find that on your spreadsheet. Complete your property management and contract administrator information. It's important to have that accurate. You'll make sure that the correct effective date is listed on this notice. The tenants are going to want to know, when does this change take effect? Then you're going to distribute this notice to your tenants and upload a copy to us. We have to have a copy of this. So after you've notified or after you've completed it, you can send it to us or send it to your tenants. Either way, first, make sure we get a copy uploaded to Procorum. There will be a task set for you. When we upload your approved spreadsheet, I'm sorry, but your approved analysis, we're also going to create several tasks for you. One of those is the notice to the tenants. So once you've prepared it, uploaded it to Procorum, make sure that task is marked off. All right, delivery. How are you going to get this to your tenants? I'm not going to read this. This probably would make everyone fall asleep. But I want to bring your attention to this highlighted section. The notice must be served by delivery, except for high-rise projects. The notice may be served by either delivery or posting. I'll leave this here if you all want to reference that at some point. You can. It's 245.15, the notice to the tenants. So let's break that down. Direct delivery. A copy of the notice must be delivered directly to each unit in the project or mailed to each tenant. This requirement applies to all non-high-rise buildings. If you do not have a high-rise building, then you're required to deliver this notice to the tenants directly. You can either tape it to their door, mail it to them. It needs to be a direct delivery. All right, if you are a high-rise building, you can post this notice. It's got to be posted in 3 places, and you need to make sure that it remains intact for the entire notice period. Speaking of, 30 days is how long that you have to have that notice posted if it's posted. This 30 days allows for your tenants to comment, to review information, ask questions. So once that's been distributed, that's when your 30-day notice begins. You'll want to make sure that you have available to any tenant who wishes to see or to review the spreadsheet, whether that's your baseline or your factor, any supporting documents you received from the utility company, and then of course contact information for the HUD field office and for the contract administrator. We can certainly provide those to you if you don't have those. During this 30-day period, you're also going to be collecting any comments from tenants. So if somebody comes into the office or calls up, say, I don't understand what's going on. Why is this changing? What is it doing to my rent? I don't like it. Take down those comments, talk to them, have a conversation, evaluate if it's a pretty severe concern. If you need to talk through it with us, give us a call. We'll talk through that with you. You need to collect those and keep a record of any of those comments. That's important because it's going to lead us to the end of that 30-day comment period. Now, at the end of this 30-day comment period, you, as the owner agent, are going to need to certify that you've followed the tenant comment procedures. So basically, you got to promise and sign a document, yes, I did all of this stuff. So we're going to go into what is all of this stuff here in just a moment. So at the end of that 30-day comment period, you'll certify to the compliance. You're going to upload that certification to Procorum. You're also going to upload any tenant comments along with your evaluation of those comments. So again, as I mentioned, when we provide you your approved utility analysis spreadsheet, there will be 2 tasks that are created, one for the notice to the tenants. As soon as we get that, there's going to be another task that shows up, and that's going to be this owner certification. That's my next slide. So once you've uploaded your certification, make sure you mark off that task. If there are any comments, be sure to include those. All right, what is that certification? What are you signing? What does it mean? I don't know if I'm going to read every one of these, but I do encourage you to read it on your own. This is one of the handouts that is provided. This is one of the most common errors we see, that our owner agents will notify their tenants. Perfect, great. Send us a copy of that notice, but then they're also sending in the certification at the same time. And we can't do that because of what this certification says. So by signing the certification, you're letting us know that you have followed all of the requirements. And that means you've waited 30 days for the tenants to either review information, ask questions, make comments. You're certifying that you've made sure that the notices stay intact and are legible. You've made all of the information available to your tenants. that you've reviewed, evaluated comments. So that's what you're signing, that you've done all of this. So we can't have you turn it in at the same time as your tenant notice. Got to wait those 30 days and then send it in. All right, this is the bottom half of that notice. I don't really need to go over that, but I just wanted to put that in there. This is the bottom half of that owner certification. Okay, so that really wraps up that tenant notification section, and we are at the end of this presentation. A couple of things that I want to make sure that you remember, take away. Utilities must be adjusted every year. So that's either by a baseline or by a factor. Decrease in the UA is going to result in a tenant notification. Decreases are very likely for any property taking the factor now until those who are effective March 1st, and then we'll see what happens then. Tenant notification must include the 30-day comment period. That's what we just finished talking about. The owner certification cannot be submitted until that 30-day comment period has passed. Tenants required to comply and required to disclose any information regarding utilities or utility assistance. Baselines required every year, but they can be completed. I'm sorry, baselines are required every 3 years, but they can be completed every year if desired. Best practice, request more units than in your sample size. I can't encourage you to do that enough. It will save us a lot of time, make things less frustrating, reduce the back and forth. Again, another best practice, collect your tenant releases at each annual recert. That'll also save you some frustration trying to track down your tenants, throughout the year. Just do it at the same time you're doing their recert. So those are just a few of the things that we've covered. I hope that this has been helpful for you. I hope you've learned something. I'll take here this last few minutes to answer any questions, either anything that we've just talked about or just overall, or if there's any slides that you want me to go back to or touch on again, I'd be more than happy to do that. I really appreciate everyone being here. So I'll take a few minutes for questions.
Thanks, Sarah. I do have a couple that are typed in the question box. A couple good questions. If a notice to the tenants is mailed, does it have to be posted on the property as well?
It doesn't have to be posted if you mailed it, but it's probably not a bad idea. So I would encourage you to go ahead and post it. It doesn't take, just take some Scotch tape, tape it to your door. I think that's probably a good idea, but it's not required.
Good. And then is the 30 days from the, is it 30 days from the date the notice was mailed to the tenants?
Yes.
They need to wait for the comment. Yes.
Mm-hmm. So the day that you send it out, that's going to be the start of your 30 days.
Perfect. And then there is another question. I'll just go ahead and answer this that I know we talked about earlier, but if we were late, the slides for this presentation unfortunately will not be available, but we are recording this session. And so in about 10 to 14 days, we'll have this recorded session posted on our website for you to access. And we also have 2 separate documents that are currently in the handouts section of your GoToWebinar control panel. One of them is a PDF of several documents, like Sarah said, the housing notice, a sample forms, and the second one is of the utility allowance baseline spreadsheet that both tax credit and Section 8 properties can use, that you will only use while you're doing that baseline. And I think everyone else is just singing your praises, Sarah. Wonderful training. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
We do have a few more minutes, so we can hang on for any other questions, or if, like she said, we can go back to another slide.
Yeah, we can. I mean, I got a couple more things. I just want to say thank you. I think this is great. We've had good participation. Jackie mentioned in the beginning that we will have certificates, and those will be mailed to you within a couple of days. Again, here's our financial staff, Liz and Wasini, so hopefully you can see their faces on screen. We're working on the next webinar training for you, and I want to tell you that it's special claims. That's what's written on here in the slide, so I'm pretty positive that that's what will be, at least that's what will be next. So we're working on that, so stay tuned for emails about that one. It'll be designed similar to this. webinar training. We'll go through all the different pieces of special claims, answer questions. So we're excited. So we haven't really had a whole lot of opportunities to talk about the different pieces of the financial side of this program. So we really appreciate this opportunity to do that and your participation. So any other questions that you have related to any piece of the financial side, please reach out. That's what we're here for. We want to answer your questions. Like I said in the beginning, the HUD world is complicated. There's a lot going on. There's the compliance side, which is a whole nother side. And then there's the financial side, and there's a lot of pieces involved in each of those. It can be stressful, overwhelming, frustrating, confusing. So let us help you. That's what we're here for. Call us anytime. Post and Procorum. Liz and Wasini are fantastic, and they can answer any questions that you have. And so please, I encourage you to do that. And our contact information here is on the last slide for you. And that's all I have. So I appreciate everything. Jackie, I don't know if there's anything else that you want to wrap up with.
I just had one question. We got a question sneaked in at the end, which I think is good. So I wanted to make sure we post this for everyone.
Okay.
I can't remember when the UA, what happens if the UA falls in the same month as the tenant's research? How does that work?
The UA, the change? I guess
So
I'm not understanding so when the UA change goes into effect, it's at the same time as their annual research, so either before or after, but in the same month?
I think that's right.
That's a great question. I'm a little hesitant to answer just because I am not as familiar with all of the research requirements as our Mr. Tim Herman, who is our Senior Compliance Officer. So I would be happy to reach out to him. I just know that if your UA is changing, there will be a 50059A. However, if it corresponds to the same time that you're doing the research, like I said, I'm a little hesitant to answer that. So I apologize. Compliance is Tim's wheelhouse. The finance part's mine. So I'll bring Tim in. Jackie, if you keep a name, we can certainly answer that question afterwards.
Yes, I'm gonna get an email so we can make sure we email you the
Perfect. Okay, wonderful. Okay, any other questions last minute?
I think that was it.
Okay. All right, enjoy your Thursdays, and we'll see you hopefully next month for special claims training.
Yes, thank you so much, everyone. Have a good rest of the week.